A timid young woman delivering coffee wandered into a room that had stood abandoned for 2 years. There in the stillness sat a man the world believed dead, a vanished millionaire, lost in a fire that left behind no body, only questions and a silence that burned deeper than any wound. He bore scars that had never healed, not entirely, and she was no one. Just a stranger who stepped into the wrong place at the right time. From one misdelivered cup of coffee, the story began. Rain fell like a thin, damp veil draped over the city. Downtown Chicago lay hushed beneath its weight, streets glistening under a silvery film of water, streetlights blurred in the mist. Cars slid by slowly, as though no one was in a hurry. To arrive anywhere at all, Sophie Harper hunched into her thick coat, a tray of steaming coffee cradled in her arms. Vapor curled up gently, softening the world ahead of her. A chill wind slipped beneath her collar, tangled in her hair, and made her shiver. At 24, Sophie was small and slight, with softly curled brown hair and eyes that always seemed to be darting away from something. She moved quickly through the doorway of the old building, a place she knew by heart, though this morning something about it felt out of step. The elevator was broken. It always was. As usual, she took the stairs to the 3rd floor, home, to a scattering of small offices, most occupied by solo attorneys or modest service firms. But today, a hastily scribbled note led her not to Suite 3A, but to 3B, a dark wooden door. Paint chipping on the handle. A thin sliver of light slipped out beneath the threshold, but the silence beyond it was unsettling. She looked at the tray. Latte for Daniel. Unsure, Sophie knocked. 2 soft taps. No answer. She hesitated, then pressed down on the handle, surprised to find it unlocked. The door creaked open with the sound of old hinges sighing. She meant only to leave the cup on the floor and go, but the moment she looked inside, her steps froze. The room was dim. Dust blurred the tall windows. A figure sat by one of them, back turned toward her. He didn't move, didn't even turn his head, but his voice floated into the silence, low and hoarse like something unused for years. "Come in. You've arrived." Sophie didn't move. The tray in her hands suddenly felt heavier. The air inside carried the scent of old paper, faint tobacco and something else, like scorched wood, barely there, but enough to send a tremor through her. The man stood slowly and turned. In the soft light, his face emerged, angular, unshaven, hair longer than it should have been. His eyes were a pale gray, still as riverstones, not cold, just tired. There was no surprise in his gaze, no fear, only the quiet recognition of something long expected. I'm sorry," Sophie stammered. "I think I have the wrong room." He held out a hand, not urgent, not insistent, just open, as if to welcome something familiar. Latte. She glanced at the cup, then gently placed it in his hand, still not meeting his eyes. A long pause stretched between them. Rain tapped against the window panes. A wall clock ticked on steadily. The world outside felt dreamlike, distant, while this room had been forgotten by time. Daniel looked down at the cup, watched the steam rise. A flicker passed across his lips, almost a smile, like the shadow of a memory. "I thought I'd disappeared," he said quietly. "Thank you for finding me." Sophie looked up. Their eyes met, and the fear in hers gave way to something else. Not understanding, not yet, but wonder. That sentence. It wasn't meant for a coffee delivery girl. It sounded like something you'd say to someone you thought you'd lost forever. "You're Daniel?" she asked. He nodded, said nothing more. His gaze drifted from her coffee tray to her faded canvas backpack, as though those small, ordinary things contained the shape of the whole world. Sophie turned slightly, cheeks tinged with pink. I'll go now. Sorry for the intrusion." She moved toward the door, but his voice followed her, softer now, like a question without a mark. "No one's delivered coffee on this floor since last year." She stopped. One hand on the door, the knob cold beneath her palm. She didn't know why she said it. The words just came uninvited. took a wrong turn today. A quiet laugh rose behind her, not quite joyful, but not bitter either. Just a sound he seemed surprised to still be able to make. "Some mistakes," he said, "are worth making, don't you think?" She didn't answer, but something in his voice, in his eyes, made her nod. As if she understood something her heart had known long before her mind could name it. Daniel sat back down, his hands wrapped around the cup like it held something fragile. Sophie stepped outside and gently pulled the old door shut behind her. The hinge groaned again, but this time it didn't sound like a protest. It sounded like something opening, not quite hope, maybe memory, maybe grief, but definitely a beginning. She walked down the stairs. Her footsteps were light but echoed far. Inside her, the name Daniel no longer felt like a stranger's. It felt like a question waiting to be answered. Outside, it was still raining, but the rain no longer felt cold. A day had passed since that rainy morning, yet Sophie still carried its hush inside her, like fog that hadn't quite lifted. The creak of the old wooden door, the man's gaze, and the quiet weight of his words, "I thought I'd disappeared," lingered in her memory, echoing through the third floor of that worn-down building where everything had begun. Today the sky held no rain, but the air was still cold. Sophie stood behind the counter, her beige apron steeped in the scent of roasted beans and sweet pastry. In the corner of the cafe, a small whiteboard listed the names of regulars, their favorite drinks scribbled beside them. She held the marker in her hand, reading familiar entries. Mr. Brown, double espresso, Luna, iced caramel macchiato. And then, almost without thinking, she added another name to the bottom. Daniel, hot latte, no sugar, no. One asked. Maybe the cafe was too busy, or maybe they'd grown used to Sophie and her quiet habit of dreaming up names for people she'd seen once and never again. But that day, when a co-worker glanced up and asked offhandedly, "New guy, Daniel," she only smiled and shook her head. "Not exactly new," she said softly. "Just someone who needed a coffee to remember they still existed." The words drifted out of her like breath. No one replied. But for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold still. Maybe someone else somewhere had once been a Daniel too. At that same moment, on the third floor of the old building, Daniel Cross sat at a desk, a cold cup resting on top of a yellowed notebook. The light from the window fell across his thin hands, one of which bore a faded scar along the left wrist. Long healed but never forgotten, he held the cup gently, turning it in his palms. The bottom still held the warmth of untouched coffee. He hadn't drunk a drop, he didn't need to. The scent, the heat, the weight of it, that was enough. This small, ordinary thing had become something else. Proof that today, someone had remembered he was still here. Daniel opened the notebook. Tucked between its pages was a scrap of paper, singed at one corner. The ink had blurred, but one line remained legible. "I promise I'll come back." His promise. One he had never kept. Memory flickered, pulling him back to that night of fire, crimson light, screaming voices, the dry crack of explosions, the acrid stench of burning wood and human skin. He had run in when everyone else was running out, but not fast enough, not early enough, not brave enough to forgive himself. He closed his eyes. Wind slipped through the crack in the window, whistling like a breath exhaled through the walls. There was no one in the room now, only the past. But the coffee left each morning was becoming a ritual, not for the caffeine, but because it meant someone still believed he was someone, not just a ghost. That afternoon, Sophie returned. To the building. She had no delivery. She lied and said she needed to check the broken elevator. The truth was simpler. She just wanted to see the door again. She didn't knock. She only stood there. One hand touched the rough wood, as if needing to know that morning had really happened. Then she left, placing a new latte at the door. Beneath the cup, a small handwritten note. "I'm not sure I did the right thing, but thank you for accepting it that day." Daniel found the cup later that evening. When he saw the note, his hand paused. He sat down and read it. Again. Then again. The letters were round, slightly uneven, uncertain but earnest. For the first time in 2 years, he opened a drawer he'd long forgotten. Inside were things he had once meant to throw away: a fountain pen, a stack of blank pages, and an old answering machine. He didn't turn it on, but resting his hand on it felt like flicking on a part of himself he'd shut down. That night, Sophie came home late. Before washing up, she opened her phone, the one where she kept special orders. She typed a new line into her private list, one no one else would see: Daniel, the customer who doesn't need to speak. Silence is its own story. The wind rose through the night. The third-floor room remained still, but the coffee cup on the table was half empty. And on the first page of Daniel's old notebook, a new line had been written. Today, someone called me by name. Have you ever remembered someone quietly just by writing their name somewhere, as if to remind yourself they once lived in your heart? If there's a name you haven't forgotten, leave a heart in the comments. Just one, and keep listening. Sophie and Daniel's story is only beginning, and the secrets are waiting. Something had shifted, though Sophie couldn't quite name it. But the next morning, back behind the cafe counter, her hands placed the latte on the tray with unusual care. Unlike the usual rush of orders, the Daniel cup had become the first thing she prepared each day. Before even the most loyal customers, no one questioned it. She never explained. His name didn't appear on any official list, but the latte still made its quiet way upstairs, set gently before the door of 3B on that time-worn third floor. At first, she left small notes, just morning greetings. She didn't expect a response, didn't hope for anything. But on a quiet Wednesday, as she crouched to place the cup on the windowsill-like ledge, she noticed a small envelope beneath it, folded neatly, its paper yellowed with age. The handwriting in black ink was clear and precise. Thank you for remembering someone invisible like me. Sophie stood still for a long time after reading it. Her fingers curled tightly around the note. Her throat ached, not from joy or surprise exactly, but from that kind of deep sadness that feels less lonely when it's shared. From then on, it became a ritual. 1 cup of coffee, 1 folded note. Don't let fear steal what is still beautiful. Sometimes silence speaks louder than anything else. It's sunny today. Did you hear the birds when you walked in? Each message came quiet, undemanding. And yet, in their hush, they held more weight than anything spoken aloud. Sophie started smiling at the top of the stairs. She no longer rushed away after placing the cup. Sometimes she lingered a few seconds longer, glancing up toward the third-floor window, wondering if he was watching. She didn't reply with notes. But once she traced a sentence in wax across the cup itself, still hearing the birds, still feeling alone. The next day, he left her a book. An old one, cover-frayed, spine-peeling. The first edition of The Little Prince. She knew it the moment her fingers brushed the weathered grey cloth. Inside, a slip of paper. Not all loss is an ending. Sometimes it's a new beginning. She held the book against her chest all the way home. Something in her had begun to melt, like ice dissolving in warm water. Back on the third floor, Daniel stared at his desk, where he'd written the line the night before by the dim amber light of his lamp. Beside him sat a cup of cold coffee and a cup of untouched tea. Something had softened in him. Not anger, not fear, but a quiet gratitude. Gratitude that she had stepped by mistake into his world and hadn't turned away. They didn't need to meet, but each line of ink, each warm cup, each old book had become a conversation. Once Sophie arrived late. The cafe had been packed and rain had started without warning. When she finally reached the third floor, she found a grey umbrella hanging from Daniel's door handle with a note. Don't stay wet just because you're afraid to open the umbrella. Some things, even old things, can still shelter you. She smiled, soaked through, but warm in a way the rain couldn't touch. In the days that followed, Daniel wrote less, only a single line each time. But each line landed in the exact place her heart had begun to open. You don't need to say anything. Just knowing you still bring the coffee is enough. In truth, it's you who's keeping me here." And then, that morning, as she placed the cup on the ground, Sophie whispered a sentence, unsure if anyone would hear. "I need you too, I don't know why. But each note makes me feel like I have a name." Behind the closed door, Daniel, for the first time in 2 years, placed a hand on his chest. The place he'd believed had gone numb, and on the newest note he'd written, waiting for her, "You don't need a reason to exist in my world. You've been in it since the first time you knocked." Since receiving the little prince, Sophie found herself climbing those creaking stairs each morning with a strange mix of anticipation and calm. She had never seen Daniel's face. Yet the thread between them was becoming undeniable, strengthened, not by presence, but by quiet notes and the imagined glance of someone hidden behind a window that never opened. She told no one. The notes he left were tucked carefully into a small wooden box in her nightstand drawer. Each night before bed, she would open the box, reread a few lines, and close her eyes. In her mind, Daniel was no longer just the strange man on the 3rd floor, but something closer, a steady, quiet breath that moved alongside her life, as constant and soft as the clink of a spoon in coffee. Then came that Monday morning when something broke the rhythm. As Sophie reached the 3rd floor, latte in hand, she saw them. 3 men standing outside Daniel's door. They were neatly dressed, cameras slung around necks, one with a notebook, another already speaking to the building's old security guard. Their faces were sharp, alert, too, used to chasing ghosts. Sophie froze on the last stare, the latte still warm between her hands. Instinct told her, say nothing, so she stood still, listening. "You're sure no one's rented 3B recently?" one of the reporters asked, his tone tense. "Who are you?" the guard shot back. "We're with the Herald Tribune. We have reason to believe Daniel Cross, the former CEO of Cross Urban Development, didn't die in that fire 2 years ago. Someone claims to have seen him in this area." That name, Daniel Cross, hit Sophie like a blow, sudden, sharp. She stood paralyzed on the steps, the air around her going thin. Pieces of something cracked apart and reassembled all at once, reshaping the story she'd come to believe. Daniel wasn't just Daniel. He had once graced the cover of Forbes, had been called the youngest real estate prodigy in Chicago. And the fire, that devastating night he once described in a scrawled note, was not just a personal grief, but a public spectacle. He had been everywhere, and then nowhere. Sophie couldn't remember leaving the stairwell. She only knew that somehow she was curled up in the cafe's back storage room, shaking, her phone screen glowing in her palm. She typed the name, Daniel Cross. Hundreds of articles surfaced, but one sat at the top, fresh, posted just hours ago. "Survivor Millionaire living in secret among us." The headline was bold. The cover image was blurry, snapped through. A pane of glass, but she knew that gaze. The eyes of the man who once whispered, "I thought I'd disappeared." Sophie sank to the floor. The coffee cup was still intact in her hand. Her fingers trembled, but it wasn't the wealth that shattered her. It was the realization that she had never really known him. And maybe she never had. That afternoon, she returned to the 3rd floor. The hallway was quiet, the door still closed, but for the first time, Sophie knocked. 3 clear knocks, silence, a minute, then 2, and then the door opened. Slowly. Daniel stood there, unsurprised, not evasive. His face calm. But his eyes, they held the weight of a man who had been waiting for this moment. Sophie held out the newspaper. She didn't speak, didn't ask for confirmation. She didn't need it. She needed one honest thing, but Daniel didn't explain, didn't deny, didn't apologize. He just stood there as if the ink on the page was part of him now, something he could neither escape nor erase. Sophie let out a breathless laugh, a small bitter sound. "Who did I believe in?" she asked. "A lonely souls or a millionaire who once ruled the skyline?" Daniel lowered his head, as if he wasn't sure of the answer himself. She didn't wait for one. She turned and walked away, her slight frame trembling beneath the weight of that still afternoon air. Behind her, Daniel remained in the doorway, still and silent, Like a ghost, truly. A man who had died once and now, once again, had been lost. Since that afternoon, with the newspaper clenched in her hand outside Daniel's door, Sophie never returned to the third floor. Each morning, the latte she once made first, quietly, reverently, was now erased from her list of regulars. Sometimes, her eyes still drifted to the high misted window above the street, but she always looked away quickly, as if afraid someone might catch her remembering the small notes he once left for her. The ones she had kept in a wooden box by her bed remained untouched. She buried the box deep beneath the dresser, alongside things she couldn't name: disappointment, betrayal, and a grief without shape. Time moved on, but the weight inside Sophie didn't. She didn't know what stung more: the silence Daniel gave her, or the fact that in those brief, fragile weeks she had believed in him so completely. Believed that her presence had meaning, that what existed between them was true, unhindered. Now she only felt foolish, achingly, hopelessly, naive. Each morning Daniel still received a latte, but it came from someone else now. And on those slow afternoons when the rain tapped gently against the windows, he still left a note behind. But no one came to pick them up. That evening, the rain came sudden and hard, the way early storms in Chicago always did. The sky turned leaden, the streets slick, umbrellas popping open like bruised petals. Too fragile to shield the weariness in people's faces, Sophie left the cafe late. Business had been slow. By the time she stepped out, the wind had picked up, lashing cold across her cheeks. She had no umbrella. She walked slowly beneath the awnings, planning to stop at the post office. Out of habit, or something deeper, she turned down the side street near the old office building. Like a compass needle that hadn't yet forgotten which way to point, and there outside the familiar wooden door, she saw him. Daniel. He wasn't under cover. He didn't have an umbrella. He stood motionless in the rain, shoulders soaked, staring into the distance as if waiting, as for something or someone. Sophie's feet froze mid-step. The rain beat harder against her chest. Their eyes met. For just a second, then Sophie looked away. The force of his gaze, something she could no longer carry. Daniel didn't call out, didn't move, just stood there in silence. But Sophie didn't walk on. She turned back, slowly, though the rain was pouring. Now she faced him fully for the first time since that day. She spoke quietly, but her voice carried clear beneath the curtain of rain. "There are worlds I'll never belong to, Daniel. And you know that." The words cut clean through the space between them, not cruel or not angry, just the truth, spoken softly but with the weight of winter. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't look down, didn't step forward. He simply remained, still like a forgotten tree left to weather the storm. Sophie turned and walked away. Water pooled beneath her shoes, the sound of each step mingling with the rain and the silence that trailed behind her. The grey umbrella she once received from him sat untouched in the corner of her room. She could have brought it, but she didn't. She chose to be soaked, chose to walk with trembling shoulders and rain-heavy hair, because this time she no longer wanted to hide from how she felt. Behind her, Daniel stayed rooted. He watched until her shape vanished around the corner. Then he lowered his head and let the rain fall across his face. No one could tell if it was water or something else. The wooden door behind him remained slightly open, as if waiting. But no one came back. There was no coffee, no note, no one standing outside each morning. And Daniel understood. For the first time in 2 years, it wasn't he who had chosen to disappear. This time, someone else had chosen to let him go first. Since that rainy day, Sophie never returned to the old building. She no longer passed the corner street, no longer slipped through the narrow alleyway where wind moaned between two stained brick walls. Every morning she left the house earlier than necessary, not to make time, but to avoid everything that might remind her of what she'd tried so hard to forget. She worked harder, smiled more at customers, and spent her free hours decluttering the already cramped apartment she lived in. But the emptiness didn't clear out. It stayed, on the kitchen table, on her pillow, in the lukewarm tea she drank. At midnight, A week after that final encounter in the rain, Sophie received a letter. She had been awarded a short-term art fellowship in Vermont, the place she'd once dreamed of, but never quite believed she'd be brave enough to go. The acceptance letter came with a train ticket, departure set for Saturday morning. She made the decision quickly. Maybe because she needed something solid to close the door behind her. She didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't text Daniel. There was nothing left to say. That morning, Sophie stood inside Union Station. The loudspeaker echoed boarding calls overhead. Passengers hurried past with rolling suitcases and private stories. She carried just one small suitcase, and a half-finished sketch rolled tightly in a paper tube. Her fingers clutched. The ticket so tightly the paper creased, she didn't cry. But when she looked up at the departure board, the words blurred, and then footsteps behind her. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. It felt like a skipped heartbeat falling. Back into rhythm after too long, Daniel stood there, unsoaked through. No umbrella, no shelter, no flowers, no apology. Just a bundle of papers in his hand, damp and wilting, the edges collapsing from the rain. He stepped closer, stopping a few feet from her. His breath came heavy, his shoulders sagging beneath. Water and the weight of what had never been said. Sophie still hadn't turned, but he spoke anyway, voice rough, each word stitched to the next, like they needed each other to stand. Still breathing. That's the name, a cafe and a little gallery next to it, not for fancy guests, not for profit, just for people who've ever felt like they disappeared from the world. He held out the papers. Sophie turned her head, her gaze quiet and dark as a lake before a storm. This plan, you're the first to see it. I don't want the press and I don't want a comeback. I just want you to know. I'm still here. The pages in her hand were soft with rain, but the ink, the hand-drawn sketches, all still legible, a small cafe, a gallery beside it, a place for the lost to sit, breathe, stay a little while, because that's what you gave me, he said. The feeling that I was still breathing. For the first time since she had met him, Sophie saw Daniel tremble, not from cold, not from rain, but from fear, that her answer might crush the last flicker of hope he still carried. She held the plans without unfolding them. Her eyes landed on the title, handwritten in black ink, already smudged, still breathing, and, for a moment, every sound in the train station stilled. No announcements, no footsteps, and no one else, just the two of them, and a decision hanging in the air between heartbeats. Sophie looked at him. Rain slid through her hair and down her cheeks, indistinguishable from the tears. But her voice, when it came, was steady. I thought you were lying, that none of it was real, but if it was a performance... She paused. No one could have written those notes, no one could have made silence speak like that. She stepped closer. I don't need you to be Daniel Cross of Forbes. I just need Daniel, the one who left an old book by my door. The one who once wrote, "Don't let fear make you lose what's still beautiful." Daniel didn't reply. He only lifted his hand, as if to brush a strand of wet hair from her face, but stopped halfway, fingers hanging in the space between. Sophie looked down at the paper in her hand. If I stay, that cafe will need someone to paint the sign. Do you have anyone? Daniel shook his head slowly. And for the first time in a very long while, his eyes blurred not from rain but something softer, deeper. The storm had eased, but they remained there, in the station's quietest corner. No promises, no grand explanations, because once she had chosen to let go, and now she was choosing to hold on again with both hands and everything true in her. After that morning at Union Station, Sophie never boarded the train. She didn't return because he asked her to, or because he convinced her. She came back because of something quieter, deeper, the feeling that, for the first time in her life, someone truly saw her, not for what she did or said or proved, but simply saw her and stayed. 2 weeks later, still breathing quietly, opened its doors. No ribbon cutting, no grand opening. Just a wooden sign swinging gently beneath the awning, hand-lettered in white paint by Sophie herself. Still breathing, a place to catch your breath. The cafe sat humbly on a quiet corner of the city's south side. Foot traffic was light, but enough. Enough for those who were looking, Enough for those who needed a place to pause. Inside, the light was soft, filtered through pale curtains. No loud music, only the sound of clinking cups, slow spinning spoons and the low hum of old acoustic guitar from a dusty speaker in the corner. Daniel worked behind the counter. No suit, no tie. Just a rolled-up shirt sleeve, hair tied back loosely. He polished glasses with steady hands, his movements practiced. Like this was what he'd always done, Sophie spent most of her time in the adjoining gallery, a narrow space with whitewashed walls and strings of warm light. They displayed small paintings, Polaroids, sketches left behind by visitors. One guest had pinned up a faded photo of their mother as a girl. Another had painted a quiet corner of Union Station. Each piece held the signature of someone who had once felt lost and was now slowly learning how to move forward. One slow afternoon, Sophie sat down with a cup of tea, watching Daniel at the bar. Her voice floated across the quiet. Why? Would a millionaire open a place this small? Daniel looked up. He didn't seem surprised by the question. His smile, gentle, a little tired, was one Sophie had once thought might be the most valuable thing she'd ever find. He sat, the glass down, cloth still in hand, and said simply, "Because money can't buy peace." He paused, gaze settling on the wood grain beneath his fingers, as if trying to see through it and into himself. "But sharing it," he added, "can help someone heal." Sophie said nothing, just watched him. Daniel put the cloth aside and came to sit across from her. He didn't touch her hand, didn't do anything cinematic, but his eyes, calm now, no longer those of a man who had survived something, but of someone who was choosing to live, held hers. "And sometimes," he said slowly, "the best investment you can make is in your own heart." Sophie looked down, smiling, not with sentiment but with quiet agreement, because she understood now. They were no longer from different worlds. They were sitting at the same table, in a space they had built. Among others, learning how to breathe again, a widowed woman sat at a table near the door, eyes lifted toward a black and white photo of her late husband. Sophie brought her a cup of tea. "No charge today," she said softly. "This one's on the house. We call it a cup of stillness." Daniel chuckled gently from the counter. He knew that was Sophie's way, giving the cafes quiet. Gift small names like offerings wrapped in silence. Outside, the shadows lengthened. The light deepened. Inside the little room where fragments of memory had found somewhere to rest, everything was still, not silent, but full. Still breathing wasn't a miracle, but it was proof that sometimes, to begin again, all you need is a warm cup of tea and someone patient enough to sit across from you and wait for you to breathe. The first winter at Still Breathing arrived like a whisper. The wind skimmed down empty streets, brushing dry leaves across the wooden steps of the porch. Inside, nothing had changed. The cafe was still small, still warm, lit with the soft clink of spoons against porcelain and the golden glow filtering through linen curtains. But for Daniel and Sophie, every passing day was its own quiet affirmation. They had chosen right. The year unfolded without noise. No headlines, no curious eyes looking for the millionaire who now rinsed glasses behind an old cafe counter. No one traced Sophie back to the girl who once walked away from him in the rain. Now, she was the one choosing which paintings to hang in the tiny gallery tucked behind the cafe. They weren't living to prove anything. They were living just to keep breathing. That winter, Sophie began hosting weekend art classes, made for those who said, "I can't draw." Daniel built a low bookshelf beside the window, where guests could leave a book or take one. On a stand in the center of the gallery, they placed the silent box, where anyone could drop a note, something they'd never told anyone. A year after opening, Still Breathing held its first exhibition. There were no celebrities, no champagne, just a wooden sign hung outside. Exhibit the things left. Unsaid, and beneath it, a line of chalk-scrawled script, because sometimes just hanging it up is enough to be understood. The gallery glowed under warm lights. The pieces weren't perfect. Some were just swaths of color. Some memory-painted portraits of mothers. some blurry photographs of chairs where fathers once sat. None of it was polished. All of it was true. Sophie stood beside Daniel near the back of the room. She wore a soft beige knit dress, her hair loosely pinned, a cup of mint tea warming her hand. Daniel wore a rolled-up shirt, sleeves pushed to his elbows, gaze resting on a painting near the exit. A little girl between two clouds, the words beneath it scrawled in crayon, "I'm still breathing, Mommy." Guests moved gently around the space, talking, crying, touching one another's arm. It wasn't loud, but it was alive. Daniel looked at Sophie. In the soft light, her face was quiet, her eyes wide and deep like they were holding the whole world inside. He didn't speak often. In the year they'd been here, his words had mostly taken the shape of action, pouring coffee beside her, closing the shop at dusk, pinning each delicate note on the gallery wall. But tonight, in this room filled with the memory of others, he knew he had to speak the one thing he'd never said. He leaned in, voice low, not like a confession, but like a final truth asking to be named. "It wasn't the world that saved me. It was you." Sophie looked at him just briefly, then rested her head on his shoulder. The cup in her hand still held warmth, but she no longer needed to hold on to it, because the warmth was here now, beneath her cheek, in the shape of him, in the place she'd once been too afraid to return. No one in the cafe noticed them, and no one needed to. In the hush of it all, they stood side by side, inside a world they had made with their own hands, from tea and torn paper, from wordless glances and mornings that started with nothing but breath. There were no fireworks, no grand finales, just the golden light, and two people, still breathing, together. Thank you for walking all the way to the quiet end of this story, because sometimes all it takes is one person listening, one heart understanding to remind us we're still breathing too. If this story found something true inside you, leave a like, follow the page, because maybe the next story will be part of yours.